Today's lecture considers genocide and other mass atrocities. We'll focus in particular on what sort of conduct qualifies as genocide under a human rights treaty known as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. We'll ask about a specific instance of genocide in Darfur, Sudan. We'll then discuss how genocide differs and overlaps with the notion of ethnic cleansing, and we'll hold, for the time being, a discussion of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect, which we will take up in the third week of the course. First, a bit of background about the convention. This was the brainchild of a survivor of the Holocaust, Raphael Lemkin, who made it one of his life's missions to convince states after World War II to adopt a convention prohibiting genocide. That convention was the first UN human rights treaty, and it was adopted in December of 1948, and I've given you a link to the full text. As of January 1st of 2014, 144 states were parties to the convention. The core obligation in the Convention Against Genocide is in Article 1, which confirms that genocide, whenever it's committed, whether during war or peace, is a crime under international law which the states parties undertake to both prevent and punish. This obviously raises the question of exactly what is genocide. And this term is often used quite loosely in the media or in general discussions, but in the context of the convention, it has a very precise and quite narrow legal meaning. So let's take a look at Article 2 of the convention, which discusses that definition of genocide. And here is Article 2 in its entirety. It says that genocide means any of the following acts, those listed in letters A through E, committed with an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Now, I've highlighted the three key clauses in the first part of Article 2 because we'll go through them in some depth. And the first question that I want to take up is this idea of the word as such. What does that mean? Why is that word there? What does it connote? Well, the idea here is the focus on the destruction of a group. That is to say, the words as such emphasize or stress that the genocide is a crime that's directed against a collective or community or other group-based crime rather than against an individual. So this is a kind of civil and political rights violation, but one that is concerned with specific groups rather than individual acts of violation. Now, I'd like to apply this definition to the situation in Darfur, Sudan. So what I would like you to do now, before continuing the lecture, is to read the document, The Humanitarian Crisis in Darfur, on the Coursera webpage, and then continue the lecture. So let's analyze whether the crisis in Darfur meets the elements of genocide as defined in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And I have now summarized the key three elements of that definition before you in three different colors. One or more prohibited acts, previously listed, against a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and with the intent to destroy this group in whole or in part. Based on the facts in the readings that you've reviewed, let's go through each of these elements to answer this question. So first, prohibited acts. Well, the facts make clear that there are murders, rapes, and conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. And these are all acts that are prohibited in Article 2 of the Convention. So the first element of the definition of genocide is satisfied. The second element is also satisfied because the three tribes who are victims of the violence in Darfur are racial and ethnic groups, and those are two of the four categories that are protected by the Convention. Now, an interesting dimension of the violence in Darfur is that it has been committed by Muslims against Muslims. That is, both the perpetrators and the victims share the same religion. And the question is, does this prevent the violence from being labeled as genocide? In fact, the answer to that question is no. And that's because the perpetrators and victims can share one protected category, here religion, but be divided by another one or more protected categories, here race and ethnicity. And for that reason, the fact that the violence is by Muslims against Muslims does not negate the possibility that the violence in Darfur is genocide. So again, the second element of the definition in the Convention is satisfied. The third element is a bit trickier, and that is the intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. And one very important question that would be asked in any trial or prosecution alleging genocide is what facts suggest that the Sudanese government and the Janjaweed possess the intent to destroy that is required to prove genocide. And again, turning to the facts, you see a pattern of killings and rapes against the three tribes, as well as efforts to deprive civilians who were members of those tribes of medicine, food, and other forms of humanitarian assistance. This creates an inference of intent to destroy. If there were any specific statements, whether in written form or oral statements, that would corroborate this intent, those would also, of course, be relevant. So that's one component of the third element, the intent to destroy in whole or in part. Now, there are a number of permutations that we might consider to make the fact pattern somewhat more complicated. So a number of Sudanese officials have in fact claimed that the violence in Darfur is necessary to defeat rebel groups who seek to overthrow the government. Let's assume, for purposes of argument, that that fact is true. Does it negate the intent required for genocide, specifically the intent to destroy in whole or in part? And the answer to that question is no. The motive or reason underlying an intent to destroy is not legally relevant. Now, of course, one still has to prove an intent to destroy, and we discussed that in the previous slide. But here, if you assume an intent to destroy, or it can be proven from the facts, the rationale or reason or motive underlying that intent is not going to be legally consequential. Another variation on that intent to destroy concerns why the Janjaweed might be carrying out violence against the African tribes in Darfur. This question raises the following issue. What if the Janjaweed directed violence against these three African tribes to pressure them to leave the region? Would this negate the intent required to prove genocide? And here, the answer is that this conduct may be ethnic cleansing rather than genocide. So what exactly is ethnic cleansing, and how do we distinguish it from genocide? We have a definition of ethnic cleansing from a 2007 decision of the International Court of Justice, and you see it before you: rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons or groups of a given group from the area. Now, that doesn't resolve the question of whether this kind of conduct can also be genocide. And the answer to that question is, in certain contexts, the two wrongs overlap. It is possible to render a geographic area ethnically homogeneous without intending to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. And that's because expulsion of a group does not necessarily require its annihilation or destruction. However, genocide can overlap with ethnic cleansing in contexts where the perpetrators do intend to kill many members of the group in order to coerce the survivors to flee the area. So the two concepts overlap to that extent. And again, it turns on a question of proof, which may require circumstantial evidence as well as direct evidence in the form of policy documents or statements of various key actors. Now, another important question is who can be held accountable for genocide, assuming that the three elements of the definition in Article 2 have been satisfied. Here you see a question asking about military officials, government officials, heads of state, private militias such as the Janjaweed. Can they all be held accountable? And the answer to that question is yes. Article 4 of the Convention Against Genocide makes clear very broadly that the status of an individual, whether a private party, a government official, or indeed the head of a state, can be responsible for genocide. An example of that is in July 2010, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the president of the Sudan as the alleged perpetrator or indirect co-perpetrator of genocide in Darfur. I want to turn now to some other mass atrocities that are prohibited by international law, but that we won't have time to cover in this lecture. They include crimes against humanity and war crimes. And these crimes are defined in the statute that creates the International Criminal Court, or ICC, if you're interested in finding out more about them. Now, genocide has occurred, sadly, in more places than just Darfur. Other recent genocides include in Rwanda in 1994, for which an international criminal tribunal was established to prosecute high-level perpetrators, as well as in part of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1995, as found by the International Court of Justice with respect to the city of Srebrenica. Now, there have been, again, quite sadly, many other atrocities in the world that probably do not meet the definition of genocide, although they may involve the perpetration of other international crimes, such as war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I've listed a couple of different locations and their dates on the slides. Now, why might these events not be genocide? Well, a couple of potential reasons. First, the violence has been committed against a political or cultural group which is not protected by the convention. Remember, only 4 groups are protected: national, ethnical, racial, or religious groups. If the violence is directed not against one of those groups, it would not in fact be covered by the convention. Another potential reason why these events, these atrocities, are not genocide is a lack of specific intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part. I don't mean in any way to diminish the horrors of these atrocities, but rather they show that the definition of genocide is really quite narrow, and for that reason it has a special stigma in international law. For those of you interested in additional information about genocide, I've listed for you on this slide a number of other sources that you might consult.